One argument from freedom. P1 We ought to be free. P2 Freedom can only be achieved through some government. C1 Therefore we ought to create a government.
Now, I don't know what you mean by a government. You could mean a lot of things, right? An ancap would see a government as a system of competing arbitration agencies, and you could say that you have more freedom the more choices you have in the marketplace of governance, right? So just setting up a single institution as a monopoly certainly is not the most free, even if you wanna argue that you have a rigorous democratic system, because we know that those don't always tend to produce good results that benefit everyone.
Part 2 of Argument 1. P1 In democracy, the state is controlled by consent of the majority. P2 In all other systems, the state is controlled by consent of the minority. P3 If we ought to make a government, we ought to make it in the freest manner. P4 The more consent, the more freedom. P5 We ought to create a government. C2 Therefore we ought to support democracy.
So again, to say, if I had given the people what they wanted, I would have given them a faster horse, right? Isn't that a quote from the guy who, from the Ford guy, the guy who made cars? Because people don't really know what is possible. People don't really know how we can do things to maximize utility for everyone. And the average Joe, leaving the decisions up in the hands of the average Joe to just vote whatever he feels like will be the best for everyone isn't always the case. It doesn't really produce the best results for everyone. The same idea of entrepreneurship in the field of governance holds true. You can't just have a single monopoly on these things and expect it to be fine just because it's based on everyone's opinion, because everyone's opinions are shit.
Because democracy basically means government by the people, of the people, for the people. But the people are retarded.
2 Argument from subjective good. P1 We ought to do that which increases the subjective good of all. P2 Democracy appeals directly to the subjective good of all. C1 Therefore we ought to support democracy.
It's not true that democracy appeals to the subjective good of all. When democracy works fine, that's where the problem happens. Because democracy by design creates concentrated interest groups at the expense of the people who aren't part of those groups. If you have 1,000 people who will get $10 of benefit from a policy at the expense of millions of other people who will only lose 10 cents from that policy, it's not worth everyone's time to inform themselves on the ramifications of these policies, and that's where you end up only the concentrated group participating in the democratic process. This is something that we have. For example, there's no single bill that's called this is a bill to make city folks poorer and farmers richer. But we have these programs. They're called farm programs, right? So that's what democracy does. It creates concentrated benefit groups at the expense of everyone, because the cost is usually higher than the benefit.
P1 We ought to prevent wars. P2 Without democracy there is no way other than war to change the government.
Okay, so obviously this book isn't targeted towards me specifically or ancap specifically, but yeah, this is not the case. In an ancap society, the way to change government is simply to unsubscribe and subscribe to someone else. Whatever service provider you choose is the one you go with. Like, you could say that without democracy, there is no way to change there is no way to change the computer that you have in your house. But that's not true. We have a market system where everyone can just pick whatever model they want, and that's the one you have, and it works fine. There's no wars, there's no democratic voting on which computers we will produce.
Knowing what freedom is, we can now examine each type's ability to create a free society. In dictatorship the few can control the many, clearly a restriction of freedom. Meritocracy too is the same way. The argument can be made that they earned the right to rule, but this appeal cannot be justified as increasing liberty, as those affected by law still have no control over them. Inherently reducing freedom. Might makes right allows any given person to dominate any other given person, thus reducing liberty. Only a democracy can give the power over laws which affect all to each person affected by them.
If you could vote on what kind of computers, laptops, scooters, bikes, cars, houses would be produced, you could argue that everyone's wills are being maximized. Everyone is the most free. But at the same time, you lose your ability to have your life tailored to your preferences and needs. You're subjectively not fulfilled by the aggregate preferences of the public as a whole. You cannot drive your car that costs a given amount of money from location A to B and be satisfied as you would be if you had chosen amongst many different vehicles from many different destinations that you could travel to and from for many different purposes. You need to have choice to have freedom, right? The same is true with legal systems. Contract between you and person B may be different than between you and person C, and that's okay. That's what helps us organize better. That's what helps us be happier and more personally, financially fulfilled from the interactions that we have between one another. You could argue that all these physical constraints of all the goods and services that we use are things that affect everyone and that they should be tailored to the needs of everyone. But the needs of everyone are not the same, and they never will be the same.
To prevent death and chaos, we need roads to travel to workplaces or markets to get or earn money and food. Given an instance in which we all use a road, and yet it is owned by another individual, we are made to be less free, as we are all subjected to the will of one.
Okay, how did the individual get the road? Did he just find the road in the nature and say, okay guys, this is now mine? Well, that's not what really happens, right? But if that road would not have been there in the first place, if someone did not own it in a free society, right? Now here's a guy who set up his own road.
The road behind me is closed. There's been a landslip. And that's a problem because it's pretty much the only road that connects the villages of Kelston and a dozen others besides to the picturesque city of Bath. There is a detour, but it's 14 miles long, and the council won't be able to open this road for a few months yet. But there is a solution, and it's quite an astonishing one. This is the Kelston Toll Road. And it was set up not by the council, but by, well, this man.
We were in the local pub one night after the road had been closed about 3 months. We were talking to the local farmer who owns the land here. My wife suggested that he should put down some stone and maybe set up a toll road and charge people to go over. We were gung-ho, we carved the field, we built the road, we did it without planning permission.
As you might expect, the council are not initially happy about this, but here's the thing. Mike is not breaking the law. In the UK, not getting planning permission, the US translation would be violating the zoning laws, but in the UK, not getting planning permission is not a crime in itself. You're only breaking the law when the council notices, files an enforcement order against you, and then you refuse to undo what you've done.
We thought that they would say, well, look, you know, get on and do it. This is great. You've got our full support. They didn't come up with that, and they've actually made us apply for retrospective planning permission.
The council did have some good reasons. According to their statement, they weren't sure if construction and driving up there would affect the landslip down there. But they seem to have taken the risk, and it's paid off. Mind you, they're not the only ones taking a fairly big risk on this road.
So my wife and I have got a lovely little cottage in Kelston down by the river, but we put our house up as a guarantee with the road builders to say, look, we want to build this road. If it doesn't work out, we will sell our house and we'll pay you, and it's the only way we can make this happen. They're a local firm, and they agreed to it. We shook hands, and they sent 3 guys over, and they built this road in 10 days. We've got to get 150,000 cars over to get our money back, but we're well on the way. We've had 100,000. The public's reaction has been astonishing. The public's reaction has been astonishing.
It's even made it onto Google Maps. So there you go, the Kelston Toll Road. Something you might not have known about, not just because of its existence, but also the fact it is still running, and it looks like it will be for a few months yet.
So something that LordPasta's says, and I know this because I already read the book once, he says that he has no problem with people owning their own roads as long as they don't keep being the owner when other people are using them. Which means you can't make people pay you to use the road. But this guy then wouldn't have built this road in the first place. There would have been no way for him to do so. Even though there are people who are willing to pay for a detour around the part of the road that's under construction, because there is no other efficient way to get to where they need to go. If we say that he can't own the road while others are using it and fine them for the using of this road, he couldn't have built it in the first place. In LordPasta's world, this road never would have existed in the first place.
I have given the definition of freedom which I use and adhere to, freedom as a maximalization of the amount of things all persons can do. I also gave some examples of things which reduce this conception of freedom: private road ownership, and private ownership of the government, aka dictatorship.
Are you in a dictatorship because you have to use the eBay's arbitration service when you are buying things on eBay? Well, maybe you could say that. Are you under the dictatorship when you're using products that a certain enterprise is producing and you as a consumer have no democratic say in what is being produced, what quality, what amount, and what types it's produced in? Sure, yeah, you could argue that you're under a dictatorship in a sense. But again, this mechanism is the mechanism that produces the most amount of choices for the most amount of people. It's not a we shouldn't democratically vote on everything. In fact, it's hard to think of anything that we should democratically vote on, for me. Because in an ancap society, you could just as easily opt out of the governance services as you could of any other services. And that's the option that gives you the most amount of freedom.
The value of land would be decided by the community, as it is their freedom being reduced and their money creating the right, and would increase with amount of land reserved.
So LordPasta's is advocating for a land tax here, and the land value is supposed to be decided by the community, but how do they decide this? I mean, I don't really understand what the process is for deciding this. Couldn't people just say, yeah, my land isn't worth very much, so I shouldn't pay a lot of taxes? Or I guess, yeah, I don't understand this.
This would be used by the people to secure freedom, and for services which cannot be supplied by markets. This principle would be proclaimed in the notion that all land naturally belongs to all, just as all air and all ocean belongs to all.
So it's not true that all air and all ocean belong to all. I don't know if he's trying to say that this is true today, or that this would be work like this in his society, but today we have a lot of market mechanisms in air and oceans, right? We have countries' territorial waters where certain organizations have rights to catch fish and do things and, you know, dig up oil, pollute or whatever. We have air rights. You can sell all kinds of bottled gases. You can, if you have a bunch of air on your property, you can say this is mine, but if wind blows and moves a particle of air onto someone else's property, it's not marked in any way, you can't really prove ownership. But if you enclose it in a dome, and then you get to do whatever you want. You can have your own AC, your own climate, your own level of oxygen that you might want to have in this area, and it's your private air. You can do with it whatever you like. We also have neoliberal pollution markets where companies have to pay taxes for polluting, where everyone is essentially in an infinite class action lawsuit against the companies that are polluting. Yeah.
Let me state this in the form of an argument. P1 production is an action forced by nature. Someone has to make the food, or we die. P2 if we have to do something to live, we ought to do it in the freest way possible. C1 therefore, we ought to organize production in the freest way possible.
Now there's some undefined terms in this argument. What is freest and what is possible? Hypothetically, you could have a system of production that functions just efficiently enough so no one starves to death, and this condition would still be satisfied, right?
Capitalist property rights, and Marxist need-based property rights. Instead, just property is held to be property which is not used to detach another from the value of what they produce.
Okay, I don't know what this means. I mean, in a co-op, the things that you make aren't owned by you. You don't get to decide how it is exchanged in the market. It's owned by the enterprise. You may be in a co-op with a bunch of other workers, but you don't really have a say of how things that you are making are utilized to serve the society and how they are exchanged, right? So you are still detached. Workers are still detached from the value that they create. You could be in a workplace with 100 other people, and only you get you have a 100th of the say in how the workplace itself is managed. But other than that, you still don't really have control over what you make. You don't get to go there and take home what you make. You just go there and exchange your labor for a wage. So it's still, from the perspective of a worker, it's still the same. It still feels the same.
My philosophy also holds another stipulation upon property called no profit from use. This means that one cannot give another use over a thing, retain ownership over that thing, and make a profit by doing so.
So this means that a bunch of things become impossible in this world, like rent a car, those scooters that you can rent and ride everywhere. You can't borrow anything to anyone for any compensation. Imagine you buy literally anything and someone wants to borrow it, and you will have no way of being risk hedged for doing this transaction. This would be a horrible world to live in.
But they cannot claim a right to a portion of the value produced by that person for merely owning the thing that they used to make it. If one decided to continue this type of ownership while also producing with the property themselves, then they could demand a portion of the value produced democratically. Since the right of upkeep still would fall to any owner of productive property, they would be incentivized to collectivize ownership of it among the producers. If someone had to work, and another had what was needed to work, the owner of that item would have three choices. Don't allow the person to work there, this would leave the owner with less money. Allow the worker to work there with you but retain ownership only sharing in the value produced, this would increase the relative risk of the owner. Or collectively own the productive property with the worker, this would allow the least risk, and ensure a higher income.
Okay, so if someone had to work and another had what was needed to work, the owner of that item would have three choices. People don't just have what is needed to work. People build, create, invest in things that are needed to work. And you don't know how many enterprises there would be if everyone was forced to organize this way. You don't know how many workers would be comfortable with taking the risks that are associated with having a business. Instead of people building and investing in new production enterprises, you would see less of that happen. You would see less of them, and you would see less jobs and less businesses, because it would be impossible for people to specialize. People specialize in risk takers and into insurance service consumers, who are labor providers, because owners, they give you a stable wage for doing. You can exchange your wage for a fixed amount of money under terms of a contract. This is something that's impossible in this society. If you're gonna work, you're gonna have to take some risks here. Yeah, I think this will be a huge problem economically.
National executive elected by a national vote by ranked choice.
Now, ranked choice voting, I mean, sure, if you wanna beat the two-party system that's currently in America, if you wanna have a better chance at doing it, maybe it can help out, but just choosing things based on ranked choice voting isn't the best idea. There's a thing called the Condorcet Paradox. Basically, imagine there's you and two other people, and you're choosing amongst three candidates. Your first choice would be candidate A. Your second choice would be candidate B. The second person's first choice would be candidate B, but their second choice would be candidate C. The third person's first choice would be candidate C, but their second choice would be candidate A. This is an example where the individual's preferences do not aggregate to a collective preference. There is no way to count these votes. You could have instant runoff, first past post. There are a bunch of other counting methods for ranked choice votes, but there could mathematically be no possible way to aggregate these preferences into some objective respect towards everyone's individual wills. This is a real mathematical problem in voting that people understand today, and yeah, it's a thing that you might wanna solve if you wanna have these things.
Lower courts, local courts have judges selected by their locality, state courts have judges selected by their states, and regional courts have judges selected by their regions. People can petition higher courts if they do not like the ruling of a lower court.
So he has this vertical court structure that's, I don't think it's fair. I mean, you're under first one, you're subject to the wills of your local community. Then if you go higher up, if you manage to push the case to higher courts, you're subject to the whims of a higher community. Who knows how other people will vote for cases? I mean, we've seen all kinds of insane people when it comes to recently looking at the Rittenhouse case, right? And if it's just up to a democratic will of a bunch of lunatics, I don't think that gambling your lives on such things is fair. And what mechanisms do you have if these courts are unfair? I mean, you could have a ruling that's locally decided fairly, but then people push it to a higher court, and then the court rules unfairly. I mean, under a free market system in courts, you can switch to a different agency, right? And your law between you and someone could be different than between you and someone else. And you could vote with your dollars on which courts are the best suited for you. So, for example, you could use eBay to arbitrate your disputes with sellers. If you're unhappy, you can stop using eBay and use a different service, Wish, Amazon, Alibaba, and use their mechanisms for arbitration between buyers and sellers and things like that. So the market mechanism is always the best. If you have a single territorial monopoly on a legal system, it's not gonna end up pretty.
A simple direct democracy amongst near 1 billion people would be impossible. Although it has been shown to work in countries like Switzerland to a certain limited extent, however, this doesn't mean that representative democracy is the only way. The best system would be one by which the most amount of people had the most amount of say possible in the lawmaking process.
Well, LordPasta's said that his ideal form of government would be a one-world government. And he wants everyone to have everyone's wills to be maximized, everyone's votes to be respected. I don't think that Switzerland would really like to engage in his system. Switzerland doesn't even want to join the EU, let alone a one-world government. So
the old order would be destroyed by a revolutionary force. This force would then create a 300-person representative delegate body and populate it with their members. They would then set up precedent laws and policies with the goal of having these policies carry the nation through its early years. These laws, before they became actually legally binding, would be checked by a popular vote.
Okay, so you wanna check these ideas by a popular vote, but no one's gonna agree with you. You're gonna have to be a dictator if you wanna make these things happen. When was the last time over 50% of people in your country agreed on anything? I don't think it's happened in a long time. And I'm certain that most people wouldn't agree that everything should be a co-op or with any of these policies that you're proposing.
What if I owned a property in the desert which just so happens to contain the only source of water for miles? This would be liberty for me, but literal slavery for anyone else who was so unfortunate to run out of water near my property. This is because I could literally extort anything from those poor people who demand water, because if they refuse, then they die.
You're gonna have to come up with a more specific situation and give a more specific policy proposal on how you would solve this issue. Because making up shit in a vacuum, that doesn't really get us anywhere. Free markets don't create areas with waterless dwellers. These are usually the products of some states. And again, you'd have to look long and hard before you find an arbitration agency that's successful in a market that satisfies its consumers, that is willing to enforce a contract that you can enslave someone if they show up thirsty at your doorstep.
For example, not all choices we make are free choices. If someone pointed a gun to your head and said, "Become my servant or die," you do have a choice, but we would both say the interaction was not voluntary due to the fact that your property, your body, was being threatened. However, what occurs if instead of the person holding the gun to your head, he simply exploits the fact that another holds the gun to your head? He pulls a gun on the first man and says, "If you, the one that the first man is pointing his gun at, become my servant, I will save you." Is this voluntary? I would still say it was not. Let's remove the first human actor altogether and replace him with natural circumstance. You now are hanging on the ledge of a volcano with one hand. You lack the ability to pull yourself up. A man comes to the ledge and says, "I will save you if you become my servant." If you refuse, you die. Is this voluntary?
Again, if we wanna entertain these hypotheticals, I could ask a lot of questions that would poke a lot of holes in this, like how did these people get into these situations, and where do they live, what arbitration agencies, what systems exist around them to support these arrangements, how did they come into being. But this is boring, okay? This is boring These are boring mental farts that you can't really do anything with, because in reality we have certain levers which we can use to modify society. We don't get to say this specifically happens and this will work exactly like this. We have certain levers that we can change, and we can see the outcomes of these things, and we can see mechanisms which tend to create better outcomes. We can see mechanisms that tend to create worse outcomes. So if you want to have an arbitration agency that will enforce all this shit, you're gonna have to look at places like North Korea, not at free markets. If you want to imagine scenarios where some people are disadvantaged and then someone comes along and offers them a deal that they can't refuse, you need to propose an alternative system that will create a better outcome, and then look at other consequences of this system and what else it will cause. How much utility will it create on one end, and how much disutility it will cause on another. You could argue that me and Lord Pasta are exploiting everyone who is poor in the world. At the beginning of the book, Lord Pasta admits that he's in a very privileged position to be able to spend his life contemplating and discussing these ideas. And so am I. And our comfort is built on the back of, all kinds of horrible conditions of all kinds of workers all across the world. So if we wanna say that Lord Pasta believes in his moral system, we can look at what he's doing to stop this. I don't think that he's doing much. Arguably, the rich capitalist who's showing up in the middle of Africa and exploiting poor people to work, he's not there with a gun, pointing gun at people's head and saying, work or I kill you. He's there showing up and, look, I got this really fucked up job. It's gonna be better for you if you do it, probably. If you don't wanna, you don't have to. And most people choose to work there. And this is how poverty disappeared all over the world. People from rural areas where they had to work on farms all day and all night just to not starve came to more modern areas to seek jobs that create more wealth for them, right? We can sit here all day and use our computers and our devices and all our machinery and all these software programs, services built on the backs of exploitation of the whole world. And what are me and Lord Pasta and all other leftists on Twitter and everyone doing to help these poor people? We could do so much more and still live comfortably. We could give so much money to them. We could get a white collar job, or and we could earn money and give to the poor and needy. But we aren't doing any of that. Lord Pasta isn't doing any of that. We're just here sitting on our asses, playing Minecraft on YouTube and discussing politics. We are doing much less than the exploiters to help the people. If you want to propose an alternative, it has to be better at helping people than the exploiters which you are claiming to hate.
In the production process, there are three things which hold value: the parts of the created product, the labor of the worker assembling it, and the value at which it is sold. In one instance, the parts of a product are collectively worth $300. The employee has agreed to work for $200 for the production of that particular item. The product is then sold by the owner at a price of $600. Given the assumption that this occurs in a market economy, the value of the product is set by supply and demand, in which the set value given is the subjective theory of value. The value of the labor of the worker then must have been $300, but the owner could not have paid his employee this value because he then could not have made a profit. Thus, the $100 that the worker made by creating the product can be seen as being stolen from him by the owner.
Yes, the price of the good is determined by the market, the supply and demand. But what if there's a supply shock? What if there's a problem? What if a better model comes along? What if people suddenly stop wanting to buy these things, right? And then the worker gets nothing. All three workers get nothing who formed this co-op. No one gets anything. But if you have a capitalist, then he can take all the risk, right? And he can give you a fixed amount of money for a given amount of labor, regardless of how well the product sells. If you're a worker, if you're a low-income worker, you want to be insured. You want to trade your given amount of labor for a given amount of money, and you want to be safe. You don't want to have to gamble your livelihood on the whims of the market. You need to have a stable income, okay, when you're starting off, when you're young, when you're a certain type of worker in a specific life situation. You're gonna want to have an insurance service. I mean, otherwise, why would you even have any type of social programs, right? Because these are all insurance services. Why do not have the worker responsible for everything? The citizen responsible for all of their life's expenses. No one is allowed to provide any sort of insurance to anyone. Everyone has to be in charge of all of their personal resources all the time, and you can't purchase any insurance service. You can't trade any of your surplus labor for a fixed wage when there is any sort of instability in the market, when there is any sort of uncertainty, when you personally aren't informed enough or educated or skillful enough to make a decision that would hedge your personal resources in a way that could sustain yourself. So in this scenario, everyone is fucked. You said that Yugoslavia had a problem where they didn't let the co-ops fail. But this is the problem. If you let co-ops fail, people are fucked. The workers who got together to build something, to build an enterprise for which there is no longer any demand, you create a workplace, and after it is finally done, you can't really earn anything back on your enterprise, because the amount of money you spend creating it is less than what you're gonna get back. But if you're a worker who doesn't wanna deal with this market stuff, who doesn't wanna deal with investing and analyzing the market, and maybe you aren't qualified to do it, maybe you don't know what the fuck you're doing, you're gonna want to be able to say, hey, I'm gonna give you this much work, you give me this much money, and we're done, okay? I don't wanna do any of this other stuff.
My form of taxation, on the other hand, is one of the few taxes that it is known that economists are in favor of. Most economists argue that if property taxes are well designed, that is, they tax land but not buildings, assess property transparently and simply, etc., they are among the least economically damaging taxes available.
Okay, so land value taxes, yeah, very good job, amazing for supporting that. There's a consensus among economists that these are the best idea out of all the taxes, okay. Is there such a consensus among economists that converting every single business into a co-op would be a good idea? No. If I were to sum up my criticism of LordPasta's ideas in a single quote, I wouldn't choose an economist to reference. I would choose a scientist who happens to be left-leaning, I think. But I think he put it well when he said, today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation, and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. Just change scientists to philosophers, and I think we have a good summary of this book. But hey, that's just my opinion. Feel free to let me know how dumb I am in the comments.